This is easy. Yes. I know what I'm thinking. This is easy.
Which could be another 3 minutes or so, just so that I don't get lost. I don't think that's
I know what I'm thinking. This is easy.
which could be another 3 minutes or so, just so that I don't get lost. I don't think that's
I know what I'm thinking. This is easy.
which could be another 3 minutes or so, just so that I don't get lost. I don't think that's
I know what I'm thinking. This is easy.
which could be another 3 minutes or so, just so that I don't get lost. I don't think that's
I know what I'm thinking. This is easy.
I'll be right back. We can start that, which could be another 3 minutes or so, just so that I don't get lost. I don't think that's
Yeah, I'm the camera.
I know what I'm thinking. This is easy. And parent as well. I'll be right back.
we can start that.
Parent, sister. Yeah. Right.
Yeah, I'm the camera.
I know what I'm thinking. This is easy. And parent as well. I'll be right back.
We can start that.
Parent, sister. Yeah. Right. If it worked out, that's great. I know I wish. No, grew up in Miami, but one Puerto Rico, grew up in Miami, but made cousins all over. I was with my resume.
It's true, yeah. You come in the summer, this is great, this is great. What's this? November to March, April? Wait, what is this? It's still great.
Now, this was added. One of my favorite sites. Old Big Mouth. Wow. And then I go to, so yeah, so.
Yeah. I gotta be careful not to say. Hey. On.
Good afternoon, everyone. Hello. Thank you for coming. My name is Brendan McQuaid. I'm an assistant professor here in the criminology department. I'm happy to welcome everyone to this lecture and discussion about the end of school policing. Before I set up the topic and introduce the speakers, let me thank everyone who made this event possible. This event is co-sponsored by the criminology and sociology departments here at USM, with the financial support of the College of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences, the Center for Collaboration and Development, and USM's educational partnerships. In particular, I'd like to thank Michelle Kashub, Nadine Pembele, Paige Barker, and Zach Gould for all their help in organizing and promoting this event. So we're here today to talk about an important and timely issue, school policing. If you've been following the local news, you know that the role of police here in schools in Portland has become a subject of public debate. The discussion started around the use of the use of body cameras by school resource officers, and under the pressure of pending budget cuts has expanded to a broader reassessment of the program. So this local discussion is taking place in relation to wider debates in the state of Maine and across the country. So last spring, the state legislature created a task force to investigate Maine's juvenile justice system and recommend measures to reduce youth incarceration. In the past 2 weeks, lawmakers have begun reviewing and debating the recommendations of the task force. This debate in Maine over the future of juvenile justice is taking place in a wider national context defined by the decreasing use of incarceration. So in the last 20 years, the number of juveniles detained in the United States has fallen 50% from over 100,000 in year 2000 to some 48,000 today. So this decarceration has not been just limited to the juvenile system. The total prison population has been falling in the United States since 2010. So on the national level, the drop is quite modest, but in some states it's been quite dramatic, with a reduction of a third or a quarter. So these declines in incarceration have not led to a dramatic policy shift back towards more rehabilitative policies. So we're kind of in a period of ambiguous transition in the criminal legal system, and this seemingly small debate about school policing is part of it. So what's not clear at the moment is if we're at the beginning of the end or the end of the beginning, right? Is the United States beginning to move beyond the excessive use of incarceration, what critics call mass incarceration, or are prison populations simply leveling off as new but not necessarily non-punitive alternatives to incarceration fill the gap? So at this moment, the medium outlook is far from clear. What is certain, however, is that discussions of criminal justice policy are opening up. So penal and police abolition, right? A paradigm shift away from punitive approaches to dealing with social and interpersonal harm is becoming a serious policy position. So our discussion today opens with Alex Vitale, one of the scholars who has been working hard to expand the debate on criminal justice and in particular make the case for police abolition. So Alex is a Brooklyn College sociologist and author of The End of Policing. Since the book came out in 2017, Alex has been traveling the country, doing hundreds of talks at this point, about one a week, talking to policymakers, activists, academics, about non-police solutions to social problems like mental illness, homelessness, sex work, drug abuse. So today he's going to share his thoughts on School of Policing. Alex's comments will be followed by commentary and questions from our panel of discussants. We have Portland Police Chief Frank Clark, Al Justo, the School Resource Officer for South Portland High School, Portland School Board Chair Roberto Rodriguez, and Al Cleveland, the Campaign Manager for Maine Youth Justice. So Alex will speak for about a half hour, then each discussant will provide a response. Our panelists will have some time to go back and forth, and then we'll open the discussion up to the audience. So with all that said, let me give one final thank you to everyone here this afternoon. These types of conversations are all too rare, and I'm very thankful that everyone, both speakers and the audience, has taken the time to be here today and think through this important issue. Thank you.
4:45, I think, will be my target on this. Thank you, Brendan. And thank you so much for all the legwork in pulling together this amazing group of sponsors and an amazing group of panelists that I hope will be the source of a really interesting and dynamic conversation about a very important topic. I've spent the last 20, 25 years as a police scholar, working with police departments and human rights groups around the world, trying to understand deeply what the functional nature of policing is. But I've always understood policing as just one potential tool that is available to governments to address a broad array of very vexing challenges they face. And schools are one of the arenas where this remains a contested question. So one of the advantages of traveling around the country, as Brendan mentioned, and internationally as well the last few years, has been to be in conversation with folks in local communities grappling with exactly these issues. So I was in Salinas, California early last year. Salinas is a small farm working community, not that small, similar to Portland, in California's Central Valley, a little smaller. And it's a mostly low-income Latino community. And the local police department there, essentially on their own, went and applied for a federal grant to fund school police. They had some school police, but they saw an opportunity to latch onto some federal money and to expand the school policing program. They had not spoken to the school board, they had not spoken to the mayor's office, and they kind of waited until the last moment and then said, you know, if we don't spend this money in the next month, the grant will expire, and so we need you to just rush this through. The local community in Salinas had been doing some organizing over the last several years around a Build Healthy Communities strategy. This was a grassroots effort to try to rethink what community health meant. And part of that meant moving away from criminal justice-oriented strategies towards investment in very specific interventions that would improve health outcomes. Things like harm reduction strategies in relationship to drug use, improving child welfare through investments in family supports to reduce things like domestic violence and other kinds of things like child involvement in violence and gang activity. So this community was already mobilized and was in a position to challenge the narrative that the solution to the problems in the Salinas schools was the addition of more police officers to the school environment. So they were able to turn out hundreds of parents at community meetings and convince the school board to block the school policing program and to give up the federal grant money. So even though it was of no cost to local taxpayers, the parents in Salinas said the solution to our school problems, and they have school problems there, is not more school police. And interestingly, the plan put forward by the police department was to put school police primarily in elementary schools. They already had some in the high schools. Well, why would you do that? It turns out that actually this has always been part of the origins of school policing. School policing begins in earnest in the 1950s during a period of growing so-called juvenile delinquency. If you think of the kind of blackboard jungle era of youth gangs and youth violence as a real concern. And the feeling was not that we needed school police in the high schools, because the view was it's too late. Those kids are already committed to a kind of delinquency, and this is the language of that era. And what we need is we need to put police into the elementary schools, not because that's where violence is happening, that's not because there was crime to be solved, but the goal was to teach kids respect for police and respect for authority, and that this would be the way to prevent juvenile delinquency in the future. And this was what the police in Salinas were attempting to do. And the community said, we don't think that the problems in our community are rooted in a lack of respect for authority. The problems in our community are rooted in fundamental issues of poverty and social exclusion. And no amount of respect for police is going to solve those underlying problems. That school success is not tied to questions of authority, it's tied to questions of whether or not school completion leads to a positive future for young people in the minds of those young people. And too many of these kids in Salinas saw schools as a site of further demeaning of their social position. That schools were sites of difficulty and criminalization that did not ultimately lead to better life outcomes for them. And school policing is part of that problematic dynamic. Now, the modern explosion in school policing begins occurring in the 1990s and is tied to three interrelated developments. The development of the super predator myth, the Columbine shooting, and educational reform. So I'll talk a little bit about how this soup of factors comes together to give us the modern regime of school policing. In the 1990s, very conservative social scientist John DiIulio, who was tied to very deeply neoconservative political movements, develops the so-called super predator myth. He does some demographic modeling and claims that because a certain percentage of kids locked up in Philadelphia committed a certain number of serious crimes, that therefore 6% of all juveniles were destined to become super predators and commit murders and other horrible crimes, and that because there was an indication of a demographic increase in the number of teenagers in the country, that therefore we were on the precipice of a wave of horrible crime. Now, this research was totally spurious. It was based on this information about inner city Philadelphia neighborhoods that was then extrapolated to the entire country, which is not at all representative. And also this idea about the percentage of crimes that were very violent, horrible crimes was also misrepresented, because it said that they were counting people who had committed repeat multiple offenses. But some of those multiple offenses were like repeated arrests for graffiti. But they called them hardened criminals because they'd been arrested multiple times. So it was disingenuous research. And every year after the study came out, youth crime in the United States has fallen and continues to fall. There was no wave of violence. But the theory was incredibly popular with media and politicians because it fit with a growing American conservatism about questions around urban America and the labeling of young kids as out of control in an area of growing fiscal austerity where cities are basically being financially abandoned. The second factor was the Columbine shooting, a horrible event that struck fear in places that had been largely insulated from the very real problem of youth violence, an upper middle class suburb of Denver. And so it created a certain kind of political demand to do something that then opened the doors to this increased spending on school policing. Ironically, there were armed police at Columbine that day. There were armed police in the Parkland, Florida shooting, but it made no difference. And further, to this day, there's still no metal detectors at Columbine High School. Why? Because those wealthy, upper middle class suburban residents don't want their children treated like criminals every morning on the way to school. In fact, many upper middle class schools essentially already have police abolition. I gave a talk at an Upper East Side prep school in Manhattan the other day, and I joked around with them a little bit about this question. I said, look, if you get caught with marijuana at this school, are they going to call the police? And they all laughed because they would never call the police. Why? Because they know that their parents who are paying the tuition don't want them to call the police. Why? Because they feel that nothing good can come out of that for their children. Involvement in the criminal justice system will only lead to bad life outcomes for those young people. And yet, in poor parts of New York, the first course of action is to call the police and involve the criminal justice system. The third factor at work here is educational reform, driven in large part by the so-called Texas miracle that propelled George W. Bush to the presidency. Texas, wanting to implement budget cuts, keep taxes low, needed a way to cut spending to education but appear to still provide high-quality education. And they did this through high-stakes testing, which was to create numerical performance measures that could be used to incentivize teachers and local schools to raise standards on core subjects with diminished resources. How were they to do this? By cutting back on extracurricular activities, counselors, classroom support staff, and implementing a whole series of teaching to the test curricula that emphasized a very small number of core skills that would then be represented in this testing regime. But the test didn't come out very well. Why? Because students were facing a whole series of challenges that had nothing to do with what was going on in school. They had to do with growing poverty in many parts of the state. But also, students were bored and frustrated at school. The schools had taken out the few activities that many of these students actually enjoyed about school. Being in the band, being in a sports team, or having a relationship with a member of the school staff whom they could relate to. This put all the burden also of classroom management on the teacher with no support staff. So teachers become overwhelmed with seemingly disorderly students because they're bored and frustrated. And out of this emerges a whole set of zero-tolerance disciplinary policies that first become enforced by administrators. We see suspensions and expulsions begin to increase, and then backed up by school police, because out of frustration, the schools cannot handle the influx of disciplinary problems because they've eviscerated all the support staff and created all these new rules. And so school policing is embraced almost out of desperation in some cases, because they've been told you can't have any counselors, but we'll give you police, which almost always is funded out of the school department budget. Charter schools have brought this dynamic to a new art. In New York, the Success Academy, a charter school network, was found to have a got-to-go list, a list of students who they felt were dragging down their test scores. And for charter schools, test scores determine not just whether or not the school is successful, but whether or not they get a new contract, the level of executive pay, whether or not teachers get incentives and bonuses. So they had an actual incentive to drive the students who were underperforming out of the school system. In Texas, where this all begins, it took several forms. One was dramatic increases in expulsions, the removal of children with special needs or who were disciplinary problems to specialized schools that were excluded from the testing regime. Independent evaluations of these specialized schools found them to be basically jail-like settings, where very little learning was happening, but those students were no longer counted in the testing regime. And finally, high rates of arrest of students. When independent researchers looked at the so-called Texas Miracle, what they found was that all of the improvements in test scores could be explained by the exclusion of students who had previously been part of the student population. In some cases, 20% of the student body had been excluded through one of these three mechanisms. So yes, the test scores looked better because they took the bottom 20% of test scores and excluded them from any kind of real educational access. So out of fear and desperation, mayors, school boards, principals, teachers' unions began to embrace the idea of school policing as the catch-all solution to a set of problems that in many ways they themselves had created. Today, I want to come back to sort of the Columbine argument. Today, well, school policing is not effective. Research has been done. Students do not even feel safer. In fact, schools with metal detectors, students feel less safe, is what the research shows. And this is deeply problematic. Why? Because one of the reasons that students carry weapons, form cliques or gangs, or are quick to engage in violence is because they feel insecure. But it turns out that metal detectors and school police do not help those feelings of insecurity. Counselors, coaches that act as mentors, school support personnel, they help make students feel welcome at school. And we know that because of school policing across the country, suspension rates have increased, expulsion rates have increased, and arrests of students have increased. And the Federal Department of Education's own research shows stark racial disparities in all of these areas. This burden falls overwhelmingly on young people of color, young people with disabilities, and LGBTQ youth. So what is to be done? We have to rethink the school environment from the student perspective. We have to look at ways to actually involve young people in the production of a safe school environment. That means creating an infrastructure that values, respects, and empowers these students in the production of a positive learning environment. The research shows that when young people are involved in these processes, that discipline issues decline and learning outcomes improve. This can include things like restorative justice programs, where young people are involved in mediating disputes, in resolving ongoing problems, and trying to get to the heart of what's driving problematic behavior. Because there is problematic behavior. All schools experience this. The question is whether or not punitive school policing is the right solution to these problems. And the research says it isn't. But it persists in part because it enables the kind of austerity politics that most cities in the country have capitulated to. The idea that positive investments are no longer possible, and that all we can do is try to clean up the consequences through punitive interventions. And this is true in Democratic cities and Republican cities and rural areas and urban areas. We've got to change this underlying politics. Now, the primary argument we hear today is about protecting children from outside threats. We see these very high-profile, terrible school shooting incidents like Columbine. In part, the importance of these things has grown because other kinds of crime have fallen so dramatically. But also, these are tragic, but also, very high-profile incidents that receive a tremendous amount of media attention, understandably so, but it skews our perception about both the nature of the problem and the extent of the problem. But people will say, but isn't it worth it if we can just save one life, if we can just prevent one shooting? First of all, there's very little evidence that this does prevent shootings. As I mentioned, a number of schools with armed police have been subjected to these school shooting incidents. But we also have to understand that there are trade-offs, there are opportunity costs, and that the harms to young people don't only come in the form of anonymous intruders. We have a real problem of youth suicide rates in the United States. but we've eviscerated mental health counseling in the school systems across the country. So every dollar we put into school policing is a dollar that we don't have available for mental health counseling for young people. So maybe, hypothetically, we prevent a school shooting, but how many additional suicides do we have of young people as a result? How many additional students have overdoses because they didn't have access to a campus nurse or a health counselor on campus? So these things are linked. They're not separate questions. And the money for school policing comes almost always directly out of educational budgets. But also, when we construct a disciplinary system that is punitive and law enforcement oriented, we actually make the likelihood of school shootings higher. Why? In most of the cases of school shootings, people somewhere in that environment knew that this was a risk. They knew that that person was possibly going to do something. In some cases, they had a pretty clear idea even, but they didn't tell anyone. In part because who are they going to tell? If they're going to tell someone where the results are criminalization, they're not going to tell. Who wants to be the high school student who gets their friend arrested? No high school student that I've ever met. Especially because you're never sure. And we've seen all across the country these zero tolerance policies where kids get arrested for drawing shootings on their notebook in the middle of class. So it's not like this is not happening. Students who are accused or in any way linked to this end up getting criminalized, even if it's only for a short period of time. Instead, if we've created a school environment where young people know there's someone they can talk to about their suspicion, where the outcome is not going to be criminalization, it's going to be real engagement. We got to bring this young person in and find out what's going on. We got to raise a red flag and really engage with this. And it has to be substantive engagement, and it can't be about kicking the can down the road. I'll tell you a story about a college environment. It's not a K through 12 environment, but I think you'll see the analogy very clearly. The University of Denver, there was a student in classes where students and faculty felt that there was something wrong, that this student was acting erratically, and people felt his behavior was threatening. That's good. You want people to be alerted to this, to take note and to take some action. So they did. They got together. They had a meeting with administrators and the counseling staff and the teachers, and they expelled him. And a few weeks later, he went into a movie theater in Aurora, Colorado, and shot 12 people to death. So did they save 12 lives at the University of Denver? Possibly. But they just exported the problem to the community. That's not real production of community safety. We need to create systems that alert us to problems and that try to develop real strategies that don't just rely on criminalization. In the Parkland shooting, people knew this kid was going to do something. They even got the police involved, and the police were like, well, no law has been broken, so there's nothing we can do. It didn't help. We've got to refocus the whole orientation. Now, a lot of people want to focus on the horrible incidents, and I've certainly seen enough videos to be horrified. And those are isolated incidents. And that is not the focus of my criticism. It is my view that school policing, even when properly implemented in a professional, unbiased manner, is still deeply problematic. Not because the officer was ill-intentioned or undertrained, but because police are the wrong solution to this problem. They have the wrong tools for this job. They are a part of the criminal justice system, and young people understand what that means. And yes, the country is filled with school resource officers, undoubtedly like the one with us this afternoon, who have a genuine connection with kids, who I'm sure help resolve very real problems. But what value does their being a police officer add to what could be done by a non-police officer? What we're doing is we're trying to turn police officers into social workers to address the criticisms about violence and racial bias, to which the simple response is, why don't we just hire social workers? They're less expensive typically, and they don't come with all these collateral consequences. And this problem is not going to be solved by additional oversight mechanisms, body cameras, or more training. Because again, the vast majority of officers are acting in good faith, following the law, but even that good faith action can be deeply damaging, not just to individual students, but to the entire school environment. The decision to use school policing comes with costs, and they're not just the dollars we pay in salaries. And we should always understand the decision to turn a problem over to school policing is a political decision to which there are clear alternatives. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I think I have 5 minutes, so I have a lot to say and not enough time to say it in. But my name is Frank Clark. I'm the Portland Police Chief, and have only been the Portland Police Chief for about the last 6 months. But I've been in law enforcement for about going on 32 years. I was hoping to hear some gasps, like, you can't be that old. That's what I was saying. I started when I was 7. But I'd agree with some of the comments that were just made in terms of we do ask a lot and probably too much of our police officers in our society. They're the first ones to crashes, to violent incidents. They investigate suspicious deaths all too often, child abuse and exploitation, domestic violence. They have become the de facto mental health professionals, I would say, in our community, in each of our communities. And they're dealing with people with mental illness and with substance use disorder on literally a daily basis, and that does take its toll. So I can certainly see and would agree that there would be places that we would and probably should extract our officers from. I would like to see that we get to the point, at some point in the future, where that would make sense in the schools. My position at this point was it just does not. I'm sure we're going to be discussing in more detail some of the benefits of our SROs. We currently have 2 SROs in the city of Portland, one at Portland, one at Deering High School. I formerly came from across the bridge with South Portland PD, where we have one in the high school, one in that does the both of the middle schools right now, and I oversaw that program as well for about 10 or 12 years, I think. But I certainly in that time know that our SROs bring a visual presence of enhanced ability to respond within our schools. They clearly increase, I believe, the feelings of safety and the feelings of safety in our schools. I certainly see them as a positive role model and a mentor to students that sometimes make a certain connection with the officers that they have in the school, more so than with a teacher or with a social worker or somebody that they're seeing more on a daily basis in class. And I also believe that they enhance the trust and mutual understanding between police and what I perceive to be, or know to be, really the most diverse segment of our community. The microcosm of our community here in the city of Portland is our schools, and I think having our officers in those schools is an important place for them to be, to build that trust, to build that mutual understanding, to build those relationships. And of course, I've heard from many parents, from students, and from administrators on both sides of the bridge now, actually, that they are a key asset and a key resource to the administrative team in the department, or in the schools themselves. I think probably all of us here in the room, not just here on the stage, can agree that our students need our compassion, our care, our support, and that we all want them to have a safe learning environment. At the same time, I don't think it's a mutually exclusive idea for us to support the police officers in the role, and the important role that they play within the schools. I actually took a look. We had a meeting the other night in front of the school board, and we're talking about the body camera system on our school resource officers, as was discussed earlier. And one of the questions that came up was looking at, is there some sort of discrepancy or disparity between the amount of contacts or police contacts within the two schools in the city that have school resource officers in them and one of the high schools that does not. And so I had them try to pull that information today, and generally speaking, the calls for the two high schools that have a school resource officer and the calls for service, they range anywhere from 52 to 73 calls for service per year over the last 3 years, where the other high school was anywhere from 41 to 81. So the same up to an increased number of calls for service at the high school that does not have the school resource officer in it. So. And again, a lot of those, I'm sure, without going through the data or parsing through it individually, I'm sure deal with, students, staff members, people that are calling the police. They're victims in the crime, and they're calling to report a particular incident or event. Having been in law enforcement now for, again, 31 years, I would rank Maine law enforcement as undeniably among some of the best in the country. I'm very proud to be a part of that community. I think the men and women in our departments do an excellent job. And as the professor said, have excellent intentions and want to do the best job possible. We do not have, I can speak for Portland and South Portland, I'm sure Officer Juice still have more, we do not have zero tolerance policies here in our communities. We do work with our students, we do work with the staff, we work collaboratively and cooperatively, and we partner with them to try to have the best outcome for the students. I can't speak specifically for the school policy end of things, but I know when I was in South Portland, I advocated for and I went with the superintendent to the school board, actually to advocate for restorative justice or the implementation of restorative justice policies that would be implemented in the South Portland school system. And that was done, and I'm sure Officer Juice will have a lot more information on what the outcomes and some of that is since those policies have gone into a place. But it was something that I certainly saw the benefit of and have seen the benefit of and have heard the benefit of in terms of how we're acting or reacting to kids in the school. So out of those, I was talking about the 40 to 80 some odd calls for service that we're dealing with in the school. Across the board between the three schools, we're still only dealing with, in some cases, 0, in some cases 1 arrest for an entire school year. So I know the impact on those kids is not, before they get to that point where they may potentially go to juvenile court, all the other options are being looked at by the officer, then by our juvenile community corrections folks that review these cases, and then ultimately by the DA's office. And restorative options are taken at each of those different levels potentially. I also, in just kind of looking through some materials this morning, and I'd seen it in the past, but there was in 2018, there was a report that came out from Canada's Carleton University that concluded that for every dollar invested in an SRO program, a minimum of $11.13 of social and economic value was created. And some of the areas that they cited for that was reduced property damage, reduction in student injuries, reduction in the need of schools to call 911, or the reduction in the likelihood that a student will get a criminal record, and increase in the likelihood that students, particularly with mental health issues, will get the help they need from the social services and healthcare systems, and an increased feelings of safety among the students and the staff. One of the quotes in the report said, "Until now, we know relatively little about the activities of these officers, how they engage with staff, students, and the broader community, or the impact they have on the school environment. This study helps to shed light on these issues. It shows that by working with school administrators, school resource officers can help to make school a safer place for our children to grow and learn. We say this with some confidence because no matter how we looked at this issue within our study, our results were overwhelmingly positive." And there's been a number of other studies that have looked at this. 2015, President Obama created a task force that was going to look at, they came up with the President's Task Force on 21st Century Policing. And That particular document made reference to school resource officers acknowledged. I think there was a quote in there from one of the students themselves about the impact that a particular school resource officer had on, I believe it was him. But the report came out saying that and recommended that supporting schools and developing more positive school climates and strengthening the relationship between law enforcement and the communities they serve. These efforts will help districts, schools, and communities build credible and sustainable systems, structures, and partnerships that provide safe and supportive learning environments. And it's that collaboration, it's that partnership between the school, between the police, and between the rest of the community that I feel is really important. And I couldn't agree more with that statement in the report. So I think my 5 is probably up. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. How we doing? Good? Good. I'm Officer Justo. I am the school resource officer for South Portland High School. I've been in that position for the last 6 years. I want to thank you, Mr. Vitale, for coming up here. And I do agree with a lot of the things you are saying. Punitive, having SROs handle school policies, and doing that whole school to prison pipeline thing. And I do agree with a lot of that. And there are a lot of situations around the United States that improperly use school resource officers. We follow the guidelines of NASRO, National Association of School Resource Officers Association, and for most of us in Maine. And I'd like to talk on behalf of what I do daily and others, but I would love, are you here tomorrow, Mr. Vitale? I would love to invite you to South Portland High School and talk to people there. And the difference, you don't want from what I have in my interaction, it's about a community. So the stakeholders in the community are law enforcement, city, like the city managers, people in the community, mayors in other areas, the school itself, the administrations in the school, the teachers, the social workers, parents, clergy. We have a big community. We developed a SOPO Unite, which is a drug-free grant coalition that has all the stakeholders in the community. And I find that everything works well when we all work together. If we miss one of those prongs, we miss an important aspect of our community. I work daily with the social workers dealing with kids in crisis, and as you said, mental health is one of the biggest issues. And we have such a strong, as police officers, we're crisis intervention trained, so we could, take kids to the hospital or adults to the hospital when we feel someone's in danger to themselves or others. But at South Portland High School, we work so well with the administrators, the staff, and the social workers to figure out the best plan and course of action. If someone is in crisis, they advise me. As long as there was no weapon involved, no imminent threat, they just advise me that something is going on, and then I give my advice, and we stay in touch. And at some point, it sometimes escalates to a higher crisis level where I get involved. But we work collaboratively so well together, and that's the part that's important. And even with talking to kids about violence, a lot of teenagers, violence want to solve things with fights. We try to have that talk beforehand, and we restore. So, for example, some of those, hearing those stories about, I was just at down in Washington, D.C. for our drug-free coalition thing, and hearing that some SROs come into schools, or just school off, they have marijuana, they're cuffing kids and taking them out of schools, and I'm like, what is going on? This is god-awful. So I'll just say one policy that we have. So let's say for a kid gets caught with alcohol, marijuana, or some minor drug offense. We have now in South Portland, the first in the state, a restorative policy. It's no longer punitive. So they meet with staff at that time, whatever they got caught, and I'll talk about my involvement. But what the school does first is that they get social workers involved. We have a drug-free counselor day one who's separate from the school, a drug counselor in our school. They agree to meet with them. They go home for that day if they're under the influence. That's what they usually do. The next day they come in. They meet with counselors or a social worker, but they meet with that day one counselor. And then there's a restorative justice person there who then handles, like, why did this happen? And they work on circles and why was your behavior? Who did it affect? Did it affect a teacher? Did it affect another student where, was in the bathroom and other students were affected? And they work on that behavioral chain from there and then acclimate them back into school so they're no longer home, because we found out as police officers and as this, as the society of South Portland, like keeping the kid home is not the answer. They lose schoolwork, they probably continue doing their drugs, and no one's there helping them for their mental health. There's always a mental health aspect underneath that. So we need to work that part of it. And then from my perspective, if I get involved where there is a substance use, I then, as a South Portland policy that Lieutenant Clark and I worked on and made it a policy in South Portland Police Department, is I will summons the kid, but the summons will not go to court. They have to go to a CERT program, which is called Student Integration Reintegration Program. It's a 12-hour class, 3 days, 4 hours, and has a parent component. Talks about the brain, talks about, use, risks, and all that. And they take that class, they complete that class, we sit down and have another conversation. I add their certificate to the report, and then we restore it at our level, so it never goes to court. If it turned into another substance use or some other things, we restore at the juvenile community corrections level. And I work closely with JCCOs, that's a juvenile community corrections office, to have it before it goes to court. We then intercede and find what's the best thing that this kid's needs. We've tried all these other interventions, and now it's turned into something criminal. Maybe it's turned into assaults, there's victims, there's other things. Now, what do we need to do to restore this behavior? Because once they become 18, it becomes punitive. So the juvenile justice system in Maine is very restorative at a lot of different levels. And I just was even on a conversation with a JCCO about a kid who, did a pretty bad assault in the school, and unfortunately was summoned for it, was not arrested, but was summoned and released to a parent. And now we're working on the restorative process with the JCCO to understand the behavior and not go down the criminal path. I have, myself and others in the school have already talked to this kid multiple times prior to this and tried different intervention methods, but this time now it went too bad. So we're always trying to restore that, not take them out of the school, not expel them. And I find that I believe that the SRO approach with that does create some safety if it's done in the right way, that it's not there for the punitive part. Like you said, yes, there have been shootings where there have been SROs in schools, and a lot of these policies where they're not following the restorative policies that SROs should follow. And that's really important. And we're trying to uniform that around the state of Maine by forming a Maine SRO organization for uniform training of understanding restorative policies and that constant community. And I have kids coming up to me, giving me vape pens, and then giving them to the drug counselors. Things that are happening at home, and they come and see me, we develop. It's all about building that relationships. And I do say we need to restore our schools to a place of love, not a place of punitive. We need to have that feeling and that these kids feel love. Because if they feel love at the school, they feel caring from all the adults, yes, you have less violence. And you can change. In the 3 years we implemented our SOPO Unite, we could see that our drug use has dropped by having the kids being the leaders and switching it over to there. So just in that short amount of time, we have worked hard, but we've worked all hard together as a community. So thank you for your time.
Good afternoon. My name is Roberto Rodriguez. I am the chair of the Portland School Board. I should begin by saying that I'm not here speaking on behalf of the school board or of the district, and that I am very much speaking my own opinions and trying to share some of the concerns that I personally hold. As a school board member, that's the lens with which I approach this conversation. I'm in charge of allocating funds through a budget every year to advance programming that's tied to the comprehensive plan that we've all agreed to follow. It's what we call the Portland Promise. We have 4 clearly stated goals, and they include equity, whole student, achievement, and people. And we have specific criteria that we're following to track how we're advancing those goals. Now, I think that Mr. Vitale spoke to what is at the core of my concerns for the SRO program. What are we giving up? What's the trade-off to spending money to have police officers in our high schools at the tune of $130,000 a year? Earlier this week, and Chief Clark was there at our meeting, we had a presentation at the school board level speaking of some of our special ed and English language learning programming. And speaking of what is not just our legal mandate, but what should be our moral guidance of how do we provide the essential resources that are needed to take care of the needs of our children. And here's a couple of key data points that stood out to me. The American Association of School Psychologists, they recommend that the ratios students to psychologists are 700 to 1. In Portland Public Schools, our ratios are 1,226 to 1. Special ed coordinators, our surrounding districts, the ratios that they have are 92 students to 1 coordinator. Here in Portland, we're at 269 students to 1. We're about to enter a, once again, really difficult budget season where we have been asked to look at potential cost-saving strategies. Our pool of money, our funds are limited. One of the things that we are going to, and we have done in the past, looked at is making cuts that are going to have a direct effect in class sizes. And we know that there's data proven that by increasing class sizes, you're jeopardizing the effectiveness of the education that you're providing to your students. Another point that Mr. Vitale made, the way that we've normalized the presence of police officers in our schools changes the way that the community looks at the way that we need to deal with the behavioral problems of some of our children. So I want to share something that happened to me, or something that a friend of mine shared with me. She's a parent at a school district not here in Portland, and she is very much involved in her school community. She frequently goes to the school board meetings, and she and a group of friends have strongly advocated several times for the school board to address some issues. Earlier, or rather late last year, she tells me, I'm getting a group of parents together, and we're pushing the school board to hire an SRO. And I was thrown off because clearly, for some time now, I've been questioning the effectiveness of SROs. And I said, well, tell me, why is that? Why is it that this is your, currently your interest? And she says, these kids today are just out of control. So this very much involved and strong advocate for public education parent, her immediate response to what is behavioral issues in the school and adolescent behavior is bring police to the scene. So we are, in essence, training the community to think that policing children is the best way to deal with these unfortunate instances. Now, having said that, I want to acknowledge that I strongly believe that it's important for every public school district to have a strong relationship with their local police department. And as I said on Tuesday night, I'm immensely grateful for the partnership that we currently have with the police department. And I know that my superintendent, who I hold in really high respect and high regards, has a strong relationship with the chief, and that they've worked together collaboratively to address the concerns that the school board has raised. And I think that there's a lot that can be done through those partnerships. The police department has resources that the school department will never have, right? There's things that they can do through their investigative procedures that allows us to prevent some really unfortunate issues and even get to the bottom of some crimes that actually are taking place. So again, those relationships need to happen. I'm not here to advocate that we not have any connection with the police department, quite the opposite. I'm here for us to advocate that we find ways to create those partnerships, to achieve some of the positive effects of having a relationship with our local police, but to avoid these unintended consequences that we clearly see through the data and through our outcomes that are negatively affecting the quality of education that we're providing for our most vulnerable members of our school community. I'm looking forward to hearing questions from the audience in a moment, and certainly to hear Al Cleveland speak in a few moments. Thank you.
Excuse excuse me as I recover from a little bit of a cold. My name is Al Cleveland, and I am the campaign manager of Maine Youth Justice. And Maine Youth Justice is a campaign full of hundreds of young people all across the state, fighting for a new vision of youth justice in Maine that doesn't involve kids getting locked up in cages or young people having to deal with the overwhelming policing of their communities or in their schools. I just want to thank everyone for their comments and for Professor Vitelli for his comments to us. And it really resonates with a lot what we've been learning as a campaign over the last few months. Maine Youth Justice in January led over 10 visioning sessions with over 350 young people who are involved with the justice system and who are living in poverty all across the state. And one thing that was really, really clear in all of those visioning sessions is that the young people who we work with, who are leading our campaign, their first involvement with the justice system happened in schools. So for most of the kids who are incarcerated right now in Long Creek and who were formerly incarcerated in Long Creek, they had one of their first experiences was getting cuffed in school or having an SRO give them a hard time. That type of trauma then has led to impacts that have affected them for the rest of their life. I want to give a shout out to the group of South Portland High School students, JUMP, that have been working now for about over 2 years to build the restorative justice policies and programs that you're currently seeing at the school that we just heard about. That effort didn't happen because of any SROs or because of the police. It happened because of a deep, deep organizing that young people did, where they said, we are the best ones to care for our peers, and we are the best ones to solve harm that's happening. You see, restorative justice and transformative justice, those are really, really cool ways of dealing with harm. And they're built on this premise that community, young people, are the best ones to hold community accountable. The problem is when you try to say, well, we're going to hold each other accountable, except one person has cuffs and a gun. One person has the ability to take someone away from their school and from their community. And that power imbalance is what the problem is. Maine Youth Justice is one of our big tenets, is getting all SROs out of schools in Maine. It's also to reimagine the way that police operates in all of our communities, because young people have seen that police and that type of power over them doesn't help them take accountability for their actions, and nor does it respond to the accountability that oftentimes educators and administrations must be taking for their actions to them. See, a lot of young people in the state are dealing with immense poverty, housing insecurity, not having their basic resources met. So when we talk about what we should be investing in, oftentimes it's investing in them, investing in programs that provide them food, because a lot of young people, the breakfast and the lunches that they receive at school is the meal that they can count on, providing them with access to arts programs and sports. When we asked young people in Waterville how they would spend the $18 million that we currently spend to incarcerate young people, all of their ideas were basically they just want free sports. I mean, they were so barred from having access to recreational activities because of the costs associated with them. So I asked the question why we continue to spend millions of dollars in school policing when our young people are asking for resources to increase their creativity and their own skills and their own tools. We see quite often that restorative justice is an effective way of solving harm, and it's most led by when young people have the skills to practice it. So when you actually invest in those additional educational opportunities, you have impacts that are beyond anything that we can expect. There's a quote that I think of that came from one of our visioning sessions in Lewiston with a Lewiston High School student, where she said, instead of protecting us, they are collecting us. And in that, a lot of students, specifically students of color, students who are LGBTQ, and students with disabilities, have seen that they are disproportionately targeted by SROs. And so from the get-go, they're being pushed aside. However, restorative justice tells us that we can build communities with all of us, and that those who are typically marginalized actually can be at the center of healing and the center of determining the accountability that they need or for need their community to take for them. Love has to be at the center of all of our principles when we're talking about how to create safety. And the problem with SROs is that it's impossible for love to be at the center of school policing because of that power imbalance I talked a little bit about. See, Maine Youth Justice, we are calling for investment in a credible messenger program, where rather than having school police officers be the role models for communities, we invest in people who look like our students, who have lived experiences as our students, to build relationships and partnerships and mentorships. Credible Messenger program, as seen, is way more effective than SROs in helping young people build healthy relationships with adults. We're also calling for an investment in the creativity of young people. And when young people don't feel safe at their schools, it prevents them from leaning into their full education. And I see in Maine, we don't have a lot of good data on SROs and arrests in school. That's one of our big problems. We don't know how many young people are arrested across the state, and we don't know as well how that interacts with the juvenile justice system. From the get-go, there's a lack of information, and there's a lack of information that we as the public don't have. And this is a big problem. But we do know from the voices of young people that they're calling for something different. They're calling for us to re-envision the way we build safety, that the status quo is failing us, and that there are actually new ways of doing things that center young people and their experiences, and that's what we should be investing in and supporting fully. Thank you, guys.
So I just want to thank all the panelists. We did a great job keeping mostly to time. So now we're going to go down the line and give everyone an opportunity to respond one more time, and then open it up to questions.
Very efficient panel, wow, and just a ton of stuff, and really actually just my sincere thanks for the deep engagement with what is a very difficult question that people are struggling with. And you know, who would not want Officer Justo working with kids in their school, right? He's obviously there for all the right reasons, the personal motivation, he's connecting with the kids, right? The question is, what value is added by having him be a police officer? Like, functionally, what does that bring to that interaction that couldn't be accomplished in some other way that does not come with those collateral consequences? And this is the kind of the part of the mistake we make about this, again, is trying to think that, well, if we just turn the police into social workers or counselors, that this will fix the problem, rather than actually hiring social workers and counselors. I don't think that the value added is worth the trade-offs, because their connection to law enforcement actually undermines their ability to connect with young people. And there are institutional pressures about being in law enforcement that will always fundamentally color those interactions. It comes with a kind of worldview. Let me address the study that the chief brought up. And I haven't had a chance to read it. I will when I get home. But we see sometimes these kinds of cost evaluation studies about the money that's saved by relying on policing. But these studies always assume that the calculation is between do nothing or use the police. But this is not the option in front of us. It imagines that the only possible way that we could reduce property destruction, reduce violence, reduce calls to 911 is through school policing. But this is not the choice. The question is whether or not we can develop alternative strategies of accomplishing these things with fewer secondary social costs, which are also never included in these calculations. They will give you a complex econometric counting of the dollar value of a prevented injury. But they never ascribe a dollar value cost to a youth incarceration, to an act of use of force. Even a totally lawful use of force by a police officer can be a traumatic experience for a juvenile that can have lifelong implications. How do we ascribe a cost to that? Even if we could, which the economists will put a cost on anything if we ask them enough times, that cost is never included in those calculations. And that, to me, is part of the problem here, is that we just assume that policing is the only possible option that's available to address this problem. I wanted to just talk about credible messengers for a second. So we have this very kind of tragically ironic situation in New York. Because of the budget cuts and because teachers are overwhelmed, often in many schools, and I should say in New York City, we have 5,000 NYPD personnel in the city school system. 5,000. And the irony is that they are often the only people in the school who look like the students who go to school there, who come from the same communities. And yes, there are many students who develop close relationships with these SROs. But it is also the job of those SROs to put kids on gang databases, to report them for narcotics violations, and to arrest them and take them to jail, which is always going to undermine their ability to be mentors, to be there in the long run for these young people, even when they get into some trouble. Even when they want to talk about a friend of theirs who may be getting into trouble. They're legally obligated to turn certain kinds of reports like that over to the criminal justice system. And students know this. So we've got to create something like a credible messenger program. There need to be people in the school who can directly relate to young people regardless of what community they come from. And they have to have credibility in a way that law enforcement officers are always hamstrung. I'm not saying it's impossible. I'm not saying that the best of them don't overcome that obstacle in incredibly powerful and meaningful ways, but overall, this is a problem. And so, yes, we need to look to bring people into the schools who are not connected to the criminal justice system, who can relate to the kinds of problems that young people are bringing in the front door. Because the vast majority of problems in the schools are not a product of the school, they're a product of what's going on in the rest of this young person's life. Teachers can't solve it. I don't think school police can solve it, but we need better integration of communities and schools. One of the exciting things that's happening across the country is the so-called community schools model, where cities are using schools as resource centers to provide services not only to children but also to their families. We have some of these programs underway in New York. They're showing tremendous success. Other states have been experimenting with this, and it's something we should look into further. Thank you.
Thanks, and I'll echo the same thing, that very interesting afternoon so far with the different perspectives, and I appreciate everyone being here. I was a little offended, Al, I'll have to tell you, from I can love as a police officer, just because there's a difference there, I can love it. And actually, on that point, I definitely have seen a lot of acts of caring and kindness on behalf of our SROs and police officers over the years. I mean, I've literally seen them tying, when I say kids, I mean like high school age kids, tying their sneakers, buying them clothing because they don't have enough clothing, buying them, giving them money for something to eat after school, literally buying a bed in one instance for a young lady because she was sleeping on the floor with her brothers and sisters. So I can appreciate, again, the other perspective, but certainly there's a lot to be said for the other side as well. The professor just made reference to, having better integration of communities and schools, and I certainly advocate for that. And part of that I see is, I think it was like 1829, Sir Robert Peel developed, he's kind of considered the father of modern day policing, and he developed these Peelian principles, and one of which that I've always held on to since the first time I read it, probably in the 80s, was the public are the police and the police are the public. We are part of the community as well, and we don't want to be a part. Obviously we have a certain legal and statutory authority to enforce the law when appropriate and to enforce it appropriately. Both of those are true, but we also don't want to be considered as an invading force into the school. We want to be part of the school. We want to be part of the community, and I think that's the only way that we're going to succeed as a community, is to have that integration and to have us be a part of it. One thing that I noted too, some of the benefits. We were talking about, what does a police officer in the school bring that a non-police officer doesn't? The officers that we actually they know that beat. That becomes their beat. Again, the schools are a microcosm of our community. The police officer that's in the school is basically assigned to a footbeat in their neighborhood, or in that neighborhood. And there was just this school year, there was an incident in one of those schools where there was a couple phone calls that indicated that somebody had a gun in the school, and that there was more information that I probably can't go into, but that there was something happening in one of the upstairs bathrooms. Well, that officer that was in the school at that time was in the bathroom in about 40 seconds. The officers that were outside the school that didn't know the layout of the school wouldn't have known the layout of the school, because that's not where they are every day. And the schools in Portland are large, and I certainly wouldn't have known where the particular bathroom was. Again, just some of the benefits for when those incidents do take place. And again, I don't want to be a fearmonger, so I don't want to go into like that whole piece of it, but that is another area. Obviously, the active threat and the active scenarios, it's not a matter, unfortunately, as a realist, of if there's going to be another school shooting, it's a matter of when and where. The last one where a child was killed was in January of this year. The last one where a school resource officer or officer that was in the school intervened was December of last year. So it does happen. It doesn't happen every time, unfortunately. I wish we could say that we were that good and that it could and that it would, but I can't say that. But I certainly do believe that our officers are part of the community. They're part of the school community. They belong there. I believe they're supported there, as I believe we are more broadly in the more broader community. So I appreciate it. Thank you.
Echo the same thing. Thank you, everybody. I would like to talk a little bit about some numbers and stuff that Al talked about. I've been in the school for 6 years, and yes, crimes happen in schools. So there are little things, bullies and harassment, that stuff could happen at low level, but sexual assaults, aggravated assaults, things like that do happen in our schools, unfortunately. In the 6 years I've been there, I had to actually take 3 people to jail. And the reason I had to take 3 people to jail is because a judge told me I had to take 3 people to jail. Not because, it's because one was for a rape, and the other 2 was for major criminal activity, and another one for failure to appear constantly in court. They were eventually all released, but that I was told by a JCCO that I had to do that. Anybody that I actually had to put handcuffs on due to violent assaults, I released them to the parents and worked restoratively to get them back into the school safely, to work a safety plan, and to get them back into the community. And when you say that you would want more social workers, I totally agree. But with an incident that happened a couple of weeks ago, when we had 6 boys fighting, and then when it was broken up, they left and I got on scene, and then the one kid who we talked many times about then went after the other kid, and I said stop, but they kept on going, and I had to go hands-on. It wasn't pretty, and I'm sorry, it's not pretty. And I don't know what social worker would have handled that situation professionally and calmly enough to then constantly talk to the kid and then bring him into my office and restore the situation. I was just on the phone with the JCCO with one of them, about one of them, and I said, yes, we need to restore it. He's going to be 18 soon, in a couple of days. If we don't restore now and do our best, we are going to have someone in the community that's going to be doing more criminal behavior, and it's going to be more punitive. So Long Creek right now, just to give you some numbers, the DOC, Department of Corrections, JCCOs, Juvenile Community Corrections officers, they have 2,000 kids in the state of Maine on their list right now, daily. They supervise 2,000 kids. 34 of them are in Long Creek in jail. Out of those 34, they are there for felony offenses, rapes, aggravated assaults, attempted murder. The number increases to 54, roughly, on and off for kids who are held for maybe a possible of 2 hours. Maybe a JCCO said you had to hold them because they committed more criminal conduct, or they're waiting for placement. We need more resources. That kids who are being held for residential treatment, that are for treatment plans, shouldn't be held at Long Creek if the goal is the residential treatment. So out of those 2,000 kids, we have 34 that are considered threats to society. And they are doing their best to, I don't know the specifics of each one, but they are major felonies, major crimes. And unfortunately, kids do sometimes commit those. Yes, there are adverse child experiences, ACEs that are involved, but we have kids who are a danger to our society. That is not most of the situations that SROs deal with. So we restore on our level, and I agree with more of the resources, but when we work as a community, and sometimes even after kids graduate, that I deal with them and talk to them, they come to me, they feel, because they have situations at home. We have protection orders from parents who can't come to the school, right? So we have a parent can't come to school, can't see the kids. There's a protection order. He shows up to the school. I am there. I am there. We have some against coworkers that are going through major divorces or something like that, and there was assaults. I have those protection orders. So there are things that I think we as SROs do for a police basis, but in the general scheme of things, we are trying to restore and create a safe community. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm gonna be as brief as possible and just bring a couple of points because I really want to get to hearing some of the audience questions. But I want to address a few things that were said. First of all, in our language, think about the tone of when we say community schools and how welcoming that is, and think about when we say an officer's beat. Which one do you want your kid to go to? Next. Al made a really good point about some of the opportunities that we've given up for our children in order to be able to financially support the cost of SROs in our schools. Here in Portland Public Schools several years ago, we had to do some drastic cuts to our middle school athletic and co-curricular programming. So we eliminated a lot of offerings, and then we transferred that over to some city youth athletic leagues to take over those sports. So that includes soccer, basketball, little league, and football. And then what we see as a result of that is the participation in those leagues is disproportionately made up of white affluent kids, when we are in Portland, the most diverse school district in the state of Maine. So we've seen that we have eliminated the options for some of our kids to participate in what is clearly a youth empowering and an important part of their development, both socially and psychologically. Not lastly, actually, two more things. As I mentioned before, as a school board member, I am deeply concerned with the disconnect that we have between our community members, our parents, our students, the police officers, our teachers and administrators, and certainly the school board on what exactly is the role of an SRO. In the state of Maine, we do not have any statewide guidance of what language needs to be included in MOUs, what exactly is the role of an SRO, and how do we differentiate between school disciplinary issues and criminal activity. We are currently operating in murky water at the expense of all these things that I just laid out. Lastly, and I'm going to try to be serious when I say this, but it's going to be difficult at the end. Seriously, the odds of a child being killed in school by gunfire are 1 in 2.8 million. The odds of a person being struck by lightning, 1 in 15,000. the odds of a person dying in a car accident, 1 in 103. So I would say that, and this is the part that I'm saying lightly, maybe we need to invest in lightning rods and driver's ed. One final comment. Officer Jusso talked about his involvement in a fight at the school. My guess is that his involvement, where he talked about his value to it, was after the incident, that same benefit from him being there, particularly with what happened afterwards, could have been achieved by calling the police officer and having them respond, because he did not prevent the fight from happening, he responded to it. So having the SRO in the school itself might not have been as effective, or is certainly not the most important piece to it, but rather having the relationship with them and having them understand that the response time to a school is critical for us to avoid some of the things that happen after an incident takes place. Again, I'll underline that having a relationship with the police department is critical. That's it. Thank you.
Oh, so glad to be here for this discussion. One thing in Maine Youth Justice we talk a lot about is that there absolutely are some great people that work at Long Creek. There are absolutely some great police officers in the state that deeply care for young people. But what we're talking about is the system that we have built, the system that taxpayers fund, is what's flawed, because policing involves arrest and incarceration as the solutions. It's fantastic that some SROs in our communities have been learning skills and training to have other than punitive ways of solving problems. However, when you talk to young people across the state, that is not the norm. That's the exception. So right now, we need to talk and think about what is the norm? What are people experiencing overall? And then how do we build new systems, new structures that we all publicly control that actually shape justice and build to community healing? And right now in the status quo, we're not there, because arrest and incarceration as solutions to young people has been failing us, and as we've seen, causes intense trauma. When I talk to young people who've had experiences getting arrested, getting just handcuffed in front of their friends, those experiences travel with them for the rest of their lives. It prevents them to be able to form meaningful relationships with their peers, develop social skills to serve them for the rest of their lives. That shame, that trauma that comes when they have an experience and interaction with an SRO never goes away. So if we know that that is the norm, then I'm curious about why we continue to question and continue to look for just those few good examples. Because if that's what we're going to constantly be searching for, rather than looking at the models that are serving our communities in such beautiful ways, I think we're failing young people in this state. And we know right now, according to the Center for Children's Law and Policy report that was released a few weeks ago, that did a deep dive in the juvenile justice system, that with the kids who are committed at Long Creek, over 58% of them are actually there for a crime not against a person. The idea that these are bad criminals is just not true when you look at the data. These are young people who are trapped in systems of poverty and trapped in systems of trauma that they haven't been able to escape. And we know the solutions to supporting young people who are in poverty, who are dealing with consistent trauma, is to love them. It's to provide them material support. It's to care for them and invest in them and their families. And we have an opportunity to do that, and it's beautiful. But it's going to require us to think about where we spend our money. And I think this conversation really comes back to, as folks have been talking about, if we don't really know why we're spending our money on school policing, then why do we keep doing it? Why instead do we not invest into a better system of youth justice that we can develop? The young people, as in South Portland High School, have already been developing. I promise you their creativity and their ability to build different forms and build different worlds, it's there and it's beautiful. We all just need to listen.
All right, so now we can open it up to questions from the audience. Who'd like to go? Yeah.
My name's Bill Weber. I'm
you've got information on that. I'd like to hear your perspective on how that was handled and whether it was something that was dangerous. Thank you.
It's on. Thank you. Thank you for your perspective. And I didn't go to Portland High School, but go Bulldogs. I'll agree with you. That's what I hear. So, if there's any Rams in the room, I'm sorry. So, in terms of selection, we haven't had a selection process. Again, I've been with Portland PD for 6 months. I would say it's a relatively similar process to what I'm familiar with in South Portland, and it's kind of laid out in the current memorandum MOU that we have with the Portland Public Schools, which is a collaborative process. So somebody from the school, we have a department panel that sits on it that usually involves somebody that's either been a school resource officer, supervisor, command level person, so that they know the background, they know any interactions that those officers have had with positive and negative with students or youth in our community. And we also have the representative or representatives from the Portland Public Schools, or again, South Portland Public Schools is the process that I'm more familiar with, that are part of that process. Once they're selected, a couple areas that they look at training on. One is from the school board, or from the school department level, is they're trained in FERPA, the Privacy Act for the school system, and the program that we send them to, and Officer Black went there several years ago, but both of our school resource officers in Portland have been, as says Al, is to the NASRO, the National Association of School Resource Officers program. So that's a 40-hour program that's pretty vibrant. It actually touches on FERPA. It teaches the officers on how to interact with youth. It teaches them about brain development. It teaches them about interacting with students with special needs. So kind of like, what are the kind of skill sets, and Al can probably fill in some of the blanks for me, what are some of the skill sets that they're going to need in order to operate specifically in the school? And I would say that that is an area that actually is a benefit. You know, somebody that has had that specialized training and that is operating in the school, that has the relationships, that has the partnership with the staff and the folks that are in the school, they police our schools and our students differently, I would say, as opposed to somebody that's coming in from the outside and is looking at the situation. That person stole my iPhone. Did you steal the iPhone? Yep, here it is, and making an arrest. That's probably going to be handled in a different manner than if the SRO took that specifically. Second question, I do recall the 2019 event where Officer Steve Black, I think he had 1 or 2 years at Portland High School, but there was an incident in Portland where he was literally going around the school locking the doors in the morning. And again, I don't have all the facts because I wasn't with the department at the time, but my recollection, and in talking to him a little bit about it, was that locking the doors, saw somebody beside their car literally loading a rifle, loading a long gun, and he immediately interdicted, disarmed the person. The person was actually loading up to go in and confront a person in an adjacent building who was at an AA meeting. It was like a domestic violence type of a situation, but it was in a situation that was immediately adjacent to the school. So yes, was there high potential there? You know, whether it was kids coming and going, but the threat was there, and I certainly applaud him for his immediate action in response to that.
Sure, yeah.
So just to speak, this is on. Just to speak a little bit about the appointment of SROs. In part of our work to clean up our current MOU, we've looked at some model MOUs, particularly one from the state of Massachusetts. And in the state of Massachusetts model MOU, one of the things that's recommended is that the superintendent is listed in the MOU as somebody that is being consulted with as part of the selection process. Now, while I acknowledge that he does have some input, that's not written in our MOU. So legally, the authority goes 100% to the police chief to designate the personnel. In the past, in Portland Public Schools, probably at the time that one of your sons was a student here, there was an SRO that was deemed to not have been the most appropriate person, and that was changed. So we do have instances where we've had poor selection. So what I said earlier, while lacking statewide guidance, we're operating in murky waters. We're coming up with MOUs at each district that are insufficient at cleaning up and being really clear about what we're trying to achieve through an SRO program, and are we collecting data? I think that that is the key piece. This MOU does not charge anyone with collecting any data. I know that the chief helps us, tells us about the very few instances of arrests that we've had in Portland Public Schools, and I'm incredibly happy to hear that. I'm also happy to hear that the number of calls is somewhat small. Right? We talked about 40 to 60 calls for the officers, and those don't usually involve violent crime. It's some theft, maybe some cyberbullying, and things like that. I'll further add that because of the lack of that guidance from the MOU, that we are dealing with a overuse of SROs in our schools. And if you look at our discipline data, we see a disproportionate representation of, number one, special ed students, English learner students, and economically disadvantaged students that are represented in our in-school and out-of-school suspension. So we already know that we're disciplining kids at disproportionate rates, and then we're adding this layer of having police officers into the equation. So the recipe for something tragic to happen is very much in the making. Again, I'm going to underscore it for the third time tonight. I 100% believe in having a strong relationship with the police department, but it needs to be in a way that legally we're all in agreement with what we're trying to accomplish, and that we're all sitting at the table together to make sure that we track data and we're seeing if we're doing it effectively, or if we're just, again, having a disconnect between all the people that are involved. And currently, that disconnect, to me, it's alarming. And having said about the unintended consequences and the trade-offs that we're making in order to fund the SRO programs in Portland, I cannot, as a school board member, be content with that or satisfied with that.
Can I piggyback on you? So the NASRO is what is recommended. If you go to nasro.org, it will show MOUs and what's recommended nationally. And there are a lot of schools that don't follow that training, and that's definitely a disservice. So that's the first place I will start. They do have data there. They do have other things. And there's a basic course, there's an advanced course, there's also like crime prevention through environmental design, there's dealing with youth, all different kind of classes for SROs. And truly, I hear you saying about that relationship with the police department, but from my experience when I worked in Topsom and had to report to Mount Ararat High School as an officer, and that's what got me interested in being an SRO, I truly believe you do a disservice to the kids when you have different officers coming in if there is crimes, because one, they're really busy. Two, they don't have the patience to sit there with the kids. They don't have the training to deal with the kids. They don't understand the whole picture. When someone calls me, I know who they are. I understand what's happening, and most of the times, even if it's like sort of, is it a harassment, is it not? We're handling it like informally. We're working because I have the time to work with them and I care. Where someone on the street who's different every day would not. Yeah, maybe on a serious situation they could come in, but to answer your thing before about that, with how I came afterwards, that particular incident, I worked with that kid 3 to 4 times, working with a restorative justice person in the school, me talking to them restoratively, to this group of kids. And so we did work other avenues first. And I have a very good relationship with them. And I kept talking about the dangers of violence, right? So it wasn't that I was just overreacted there. So this was just the cost of us trying all the informal stuff that it then, unfortunately, turned into this. But I really believe officers from the outside coming in, they're like, they don't know the teachers. I know everyone, the lunch ladies, everybody knows everybody, and I think we do a better service to the kid as the SRO versus a street officer.
So I don't want to turn it into a debate, but I just find it impossible to ignore that while we're trying to promote the idea that we're retraining our police officers, and the idea of community policing is a big part of that, that you're using an argument that tells me that I'm literally just playing the odds when I call the police depending on who shows up. That I may have a good encounter, I may have a bad encounter. I just don't see that as a good argument.
I'm talking about with kids.
Right.
I think you need to be specially trained.
That's what I mean. If we're advocating for the police to be community policing and to be more of a partner relationship and not this punitive system of relationship, then you say that as a school department, if I don't have an SRO and I call the police, I'm rolling the odds of who shows up. I think that the training that SROs are getting is probably just as important for any police officer with any encounter with any person in the community, not just our youth. So
But it's specifically trained, though. So it would be like every street police officer being
So
detected.
if a
Let's,
regular, so if a
let's-
non-SRO police officer encounters a youth in the streets, are they rolling the odds? Are they just rolling the dice?
No, I'm
Let's
just saying that
let's take another
relationship is
round of
different.
questions. I'm sure there'll be lots of things to get into. So why don't we take 3 questions? The woman in the middle, the hand in the back, and let's say the gentleman in the front there. So 3 questions. I'll write them down.
My name is Chelsea Stevens. I am a social worker, and a master's student finishing up, and I have a response to something that Officer Russo said and follow-up questions to Chief Clark. You made the statement that you'd like to see the social worker that can respond to a highly escalated situation in a calm manner. And I'd just like to state that, you know, social workers often work in very, what people would consider elevated circumstances, where police officers also get involved. I work closely with the population of people experiencing homelessness in Portland, and often people with persistent severe mental health disorders, substance use disorders is often very escalated. And the police would not enter our place of work without a bulletproof vest, several weapons, and backup. And we would often go in with, you know, a lanyard. And I know there's a positive regard. So I just want to reassure you that if your concern is for our delicate sensibilities, that we're okay.
It's not that.
So,
And along those same lines, Chief Clark, you've stated that police officers have become sort of de facto mental health first responses. I would agree with that statement. And, I was wondering if instead of just having to do our jobs, if you would also include us more in your job by, say, bringing us into those situations, whether it's in the school or the community, at a higher degree than you are.
so let's get a couple questions on the docket, and then we can go through them all. So in the back.
Hi, I'm a sociologist here, and I know some people in my field are trying to operationalize so they can measure the school-to-prison pipeline that disproportionately affects particularly black males in the U.S. And I wondered if our sociologist knows if there's any connection in the research between police in schools, school policing, and the school-to-prison pipeline.
And then in the front.
So this is for Chief Frank, but, you know, this is anyone can answer this question. And you touched on this in the talk, but I'm actually quoting from a newspaper, and I'd like to give you the opportunity to hopefully dial back the statement. You said in the paper, it's not a matter that there's going to be a school shooting. It's a matter of when and where and that's going to occur. And I certainly want the school to be the best position to protect our students if, God forbid, that was to ever happen in Portland. I will also add, and I believe Alex Vitale touched on this, in Parkland, not only were there officers who, you know, ostensibly could respond, it was recently found in an article, and the article is called "Officers Had No Duty to Protect Students in Parkland Massacre, Just Rules." And the article says, neither the Constitution nor the state law impose a general duty upon police officers or other governmental officials to protect individuals, persons, from harm, even when they know that the harm will occur, said Juris L. Hutchinson, a professor and associate dean, University of Florida School of Law. Quote, police can watch someone get attacked, attack you, and refuse to intervene and not violate the Constitution. I would also like, so I feel like this stick always gets used. Yeah, it might be a school shooting. But we don't have firemen sitting there at the school, right, in case there's a fire. We train kids to leave
Well, I'll start with the sociology question. So there's a huge amount of literature on this, and I will just recommend a few things. There's Annette Fuentes' book, Lockdown High, Push Out by Monique Morris, The Real School Safety Problem by Aaron Kupchik, but also tremendous work being done by the Advancement Project and the ACLU looking at specific school districts where they've brought lawsuits and political pressure to get real reporting of data so that they can do real analysis. And frankly, the Department of Education's own research through their Office of Civil Rights is a compendium of information about racial disparities in school policing. This is a well-documented problem that does affect primarily youth of color, but also other vulnerable populations. And this is even when officers are well-trained and acting professionally. The decision to turn these problems over to the criminal justice system is inherently problematic and comes with significant costs. And yes, maybe we can, just to respond to a couple of the other, maybe we can prevent a school shooting or two. There was that tremendous incident in December, but by the same token, there was an incident, I believe in California, that was caught on tape of a coach stopping a school shooting. It's not only the police, and it's not only police-oriented strategies, which are almost always reactionary rather than preventative. What are we doing to stop things from getting to that level in the first place? We know, for instance, that a major contributing factor is bullying happening in the school. So what are we doing to really address that? Now, yes, some of the very best school policing programs are integrated into restorative justice, but let me tell you, this is very much the exception, not the rule. And even when they are, it still comes with opportunity costs.
I'll start, I think, with the first question. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
The question's directed to you, so go. No, to you. Yeah.
I'll start with the first one, with for the social worker's perspective. I want one of those lanyards, first of all. That sounds like a pretty good thing. But yes, we actually have in the department, we have a behavioral health unit. There's two dedicated clinicians that are part of the Portland Police Department, one that focuses on those folks in the community with mental health, and then one that focuses on those with substance use disorders, and of course the crossover that exists therein too. But I just met with actually both of them this morning. We meet on a fairly regular basis. They are always out in the community. We were kind of talking about some particular outreach that we needed to do to some stakeholders and stuff in the community. Again, just today, that is a frustration on our part because I don't want to send my officers into situations where they're not the experts. They're very highly trained. They're trained as crisis intervention, 40 hours of crisis intervention and ongoing training after that, but they are not clinicians, and they're working on the behavior, and then they are trying to make those connections with people in the community that can actually help. So I'd love to have an offline conversation with you after in terms of getting a cell phone number or something, because if you're one of those folks that might be able to assist us, like maybe not in the... What's that? See, thanks for coming. On the third question there, I would agree. There was a finding that came out of Parkland that, and it's been kind of that way or understood for a number of years, that police don't have the legal obligation to respond necessarily to protect somebody, but I think we feel, based on the oath that we take, that we have the moral obligation to do so, and that's the basis that I think my comment that you read in the paper, and I think I said something very similar earlier today. I come from this at the standpoint of looking at the public safety. I know the odds may be what they are. I can also look at it, if it's predictable, it's preventable. It's kind of in a risk management sense. That's kind of the framework that I put it in. And I know in the last 20 years, there's been about 290 people, roughly, that have been killed in school shootings in the United States. Some, again, as recently as this year. And would hate to be somebody that felt like I could have intervened. And again, not that we're going to be able to stop every single one of them. We want to be part of the solution before it gets to be a problem, and work cooperatively all ahead of time, be proactive, be part of the school. But again, I would certainly like to be there if that ever was to rear its head here in the city. So, thank you.
Just because we're getting close to the end, I didn't want to miss the opportunity of asking Mr. Vitale, in your book, in chapter 3, when we were talking about the school to prison pipeline, there's a little bit of information about PBIS, positive behavior intervention service. So I was hoping maybe you can just spend a few moments expanding on your view of that approach. I'll say that is something that we are using here in Portland Public Schools. And we've been rolling it out, and I know that with any kind of rollout of discipline or behavioral strategies, you need to have buy-in from the people that are in the ground. So I was just interested in hearing your take on that, since it was mentioned in your book.
So there have been a few different systems that have been experimented with around the country about trying to use, social emotional learning, and we have a system in my kids' school in Brooklyn, and I can see the effect in my 8-year-old, how she talks to her playmates when they've upset her. It's amazing. She's developed this vocabulary to talk about how she's been hurt or offended or something. So I'm not, however, really an expert in these systems. I tried to look at some of the research, and I spoke to some people at the education field, and so my assessment of what the experts were telling me is kind of what's in the book. But there are, I'm sure, people in the area, in ed departments, et cetera, who are, and possibly in psychology departments in the area, who are looking more closely at this than I would be able to really comment on in great detail. But I think that is some form of that, and we just got to look at the evidence about what works best, has to be part of an overall reframing of how we make the school environment more successful for everyone in it.
I just wanted to respond quickly to the question about the school to prison pipeline and what we see specifically here in Maine. I mean, first of all, I do think it's really important to know that the state of Maine has no set data for any police departments to be collecting about their SROs. If it's happening on the local level, and it's a decision that's being made by school administrations. However, we don't have any set precedent, which means we really don't know what's going on all across the state, especially in cities where students are predominantly majority of color. That's really important for us to remember, because we can't even begin to answer that question. And we also know that SROs don't have any uniform training in the state, which means that, as we just heard, it's really important for SROs to have certain training, but there is no uniform training at all. So that's only happening on a case-by-case basis. And we also know that 27% of the young people who are incarcerated in Long Creek, both detained and committed, are kids of color, even though they make up 1.6% of the population. And we know about 40% of those young people are also LGBTQ. So we know over and over again the kids that are getting the impacts of this system are marginalized communities. So even though we don't know how that impact on SROs, we also have learned that most of the kids that have been through the system will tell you that their first interaction with this is an SRO. So we can pretty much see it's a very clear path in the state of Maine, from the SRO in the school to kids getting incarcerated and getting locked up in Long Creek.
So it looks like most of the audience is still sticking around. So why don't we do one more round of questions, and then we can wrap it up. Michael, right? Michael, you raising your hand? The young woman, and Bobby.
Michael Pivetta from the ACLU of Maine. Before I ask my question, I'd like to introduce someone who I think was going to ask a question earlier and didn't raise her hand, Daniel Layton, who, to my knowledge, is the leading expert in Maine on SROs in Maine, and we would be remiss not to draw on her vast reserve of knowledge. My question relates to something that Danielle studied, if she'd be willing have SROs and one of which doesn't have an SRO. We're very lucky that that's the case because some of the theoretical questions are very easy to answer. My question to Danielle and anyone else here and the panelists is Casco Bay High School, the high school without SROs, a lawless, dangerous, violent place that hasn't benefited from this extraordinary resource? My second question has to do with subtle psychological cues. There's a lot of research on how the human mind responds to certain visual cues that suggests that the very presence of certain things might be so distracting as to detract from the educational mission of a school. Do SROs fall in that category as far as the people who spent time with the literature can say? Thank you.
So take the next question.
So, that question is, how do SROs like build relationships with students, and why is that so important?
And Bobby.
Bobby, I'm a criminology and psychology major here. And my question is for Professor Vitale, and if we can't get to it, I can always get to you after. In your travels that with your different communities, have you encountered a school district or community that has taken out their SROs and used that budget yet to fund for counselors in their schools, whether it be social counselors, social workers, or substance abuse counselors, or anything of that nature?
Do you want to come up and?
Can I ask a question to add to the
Oh, sure.
It's sort of building on Danielle Layton, and I researched SROs in Maine, most of you as much as you. Sorry. I'm Danielle Layton, and my question is building on with Bobby around schools that have started to unwind the damage that's been done by cutting budgets for school supports that are like preventative and holistic safety rather than security and targeting tactics. What does that look like when you talked a bit about community schools? And I recognize that just taking SROs out doesn't necessarily solve our problem because we've dug ourselves into this hole over a few decades. And so I'm just wondering if you could speak to what does it look like structurally, financially, as far as phasing out the exclusionary disciplines that are just as much part of the school to prison pipeline, whether on a local budget level or state level, what is the role of the state in repairing the harm that's happened?
Okay, so that's very similar to the previous question. So we don't have great case studies to look at, right? The momentum is still in the opposite direction of adding police. So there's the main changes we've seen is enhanced training and some improvements in oversight and like tightening up some of these MOUs, but we don't see actually stepping away from this model. So I don't think we're in a position to evaluate. My view is that we have to be very clear about the difference between long-term, broad reforms to how we deliver education, things like, the deeply segregated delivery of education, deep inequalities in the resources that are available for education, both between districts and within districts. So we have to put all that on the table, but we also have to understand the possibility of immediate targeted interventions to make schools better learning environments while we work on these bigger issues. So one of the mistakes we sometimes make is saying, we just want to take the SROs out because they're just a source of harm. But then that still leaves teachers in the lurch trying to manage classrooms without any support services, and they're just going to go back to figuring out strategies of excluding students that they can't manage with the limited resources. And also, we don't want to be in the trap of saying, we're going to get rid of the SROs and just generally increase funding for education, because that also may not immediately deal with the fact that there are specific students or dynamics that are undermining the educational process. So we do need those tightly targeted immediate interventions like restorative justice programs, like bringing in counselors and mentors who can address it while we work on these bigger picture items.
There's a question about relationships.
Yeah, developing relationships. One of the first things I do is I smile. I smile at kids, and we talk, and I get to know them. Sometimes they have problems that might happen at home that only I know about because I found out in the log in the morning that there was domestic violence at the house. And so therefore I intervene with whatever's going on, get them to a social worker, speak to them, try to see if they're okay, do they need anything. But generally, without police involvement at all, I say hello. I have a lot of interests, as other SROs do. I play guitar. I'm a musician. I'm also a martial artist. I work with the football team. We work on different things. I help them through with my martial arts training on how to develop balance and work on physiokinetics, which is like the science of the human body. And we do that, and we give it to the running backs. Our quarterback did a great job one game. He was like, "It's all about balance, all about leverage, leverage, leverage." So I work with people that way. And if they're the music, the band director happens to live across the street from me, so I sat in with the band last year and played guitar with the big band, so that was good. So developing a lot of relationships to show that yes, I am a police officer, but I'm also a human being, and how do we talk, and so when they have that interaction with other officers on the street or have to make a complaint, that they could look beyond the uniform and see the person, and that's really important for all of us to do, to look always beyond, never judge a book by its cover, and to really look and see what see the person who as they are. So that's what I try to do with all the kids. I wave to everybody, smile to everybody. Some kids I'm closer to because they come to me as well, but either way, I wave to kids who I don't even know. I got 900-something kids. I wave to them every day. I'm just like constantly waving. But that's what I generally do. Hopefully that answers your question.
There's also the question about Casco Bay High School.
Yeah, I think there's not a lot of the data that I did take a quick look at just earlier today showed, for Portland and Deering, the highest number of calls being 58, the highest number at Casco Bay being 81. So, less than 30 calls for service over the course of a school year difference with, with incident reports. And, so not a huge difference, noticeable difference, but not a huge difference in terms of running amok, I think is, or however you word it.
How many kids are in Casco Bay versus Portland and Deering? Do you know what? I don't know how it's made up.
Casco Bay has a capped enrollment, so there are 100 students per class, so it's just at 400 or slightly over because they do take, for their freshman class, they take an extra 10 or 15, anticipating that some kids will drop out, so it's a cap. And then in our other high schools, the numbers are slightly higher, so I think this year Portland High School has, I think we're over 700 students, maybe around that, and then in Deering it's less than that.
In the whole high school?
Yeah.
Yeah, wow. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. So I think with that said, we'll give our panel one last round of applause, and we can continue the discussion in the hall.